So let's go in. This idea of stability in HE admissions. I mean, isn't the HE admissions system actually very important? Isn't it about directing human capital through our system? Isn't it about what will determine the shape of our society and our economy? Yes, it is. I mean, it's pretty important. How important is do people regard our qualifications? I mentioned to Ofcol that I thought public awarding was a public institution that needed to be protected because it protects so many individual and public goods. And it is fascinating to reflect, as some of you have heard me talk about previously, on Finland. Because there, during their time of transformation of assessment, they changed virtually everything. Their teacher training, the structure of their schools, their underpinning educational models. They did not change the abitur, which is more of an equivalent of A-level than one might think, at all, which has remained almost unchanged for 120 years. Why? Well, if you ask a Finnish educational policymaker, or indeed just a regular teacher, they would say, why on earth would we have changed the abitur? That's the very thing by which we could see whether the other changes we were effecting in the system were successful or not. How refreshing is that, coming from a country where qualifications are used as the major instrument of change for things that actually qualifications are pretty bad at influencing in any kind of deliberate or planned manner. I'm also intrigued by the kind of irrational bandwagoning around A-levels, because the moment somebody pops up and says, oh, there's something terribly wrong with our A-levels, we ought to change them, the number of people who just, without thinking, say yes and get on the bandwagon is just phenomenal. It seems absurd in the light of the kind of position we came from Finland. I think that is changing. I've heard increasingly at conferences, please, can we have some stability in our qualifications? Because it adversely affects so many things, textbook provision, the form of education in schools, the nature of the decisions that children make in respect of HE admission. So I think that's interesting. One thing I just want to mention, and I think we should keep it in our mind, is that there are individual goods and there is a collective good around an effective UK admission system. There is the justice to an individual child getting the right grade, getting into the university and the course of their choice. And I think that exists in a very problematic relationship to actually getting overall the right sort of people in the right sort of place in the system. And I think there are a lot of tensions around that, which are played out in the admission system. I won't forget David Willett's point made in 2012, if I can recollect rightly, that our university admission system does not survive the man from Mars test. That is, if it's only men in Mars that have an interest in our admission system. In other words, it is pretty weird that people don't get a final, externally validated and fully approved and quality assured grade before the offer is actually made by the institution. And there is something odd about that. But we've managed to devise a whole series of very interesting systems to overcome the problem that particular mode of arranging things actually brings about in our system. I mean, all of the discussion about PQA seems very obvious, PQA, until you think that actually the only real way of delivering it is to squeeze the amount of time in the already incredibly short specialist courses that we have in the advanced FEMS. I'm also a bit, in terms of irrational thinking, I'm a bit bothered by all this talk which comes out at conference after conference, seminar after seminar, that the A-level does not predict. I mean, that just is said time after time. Everybody nods sagely around the room as if it is a known truth. It's not true. So the moment one becomes at all granular, the moment you look at UMS, the moment you look at certain relationships, the A-level does predict. And that's one of the things that Richard and I have discussed for a long time. I mean, I must commend very much the kind of work which Richard personally is pretty much responsible for in terms of putting very, very detailed analysis of the kind of data floating around the system and present in Cambridge in terms of understanding the relationship between the data which people bring in the form of grades to the institution and what actually happens once they are here. Some of the most incisive internal research within an institution has been done in Cambridge, initiated by Richard. I mean, Jeff Park started a lot of this, but Richard has really pushed it to be a pretty elaborate programme of work, with now a public dimension. And I think that's one of the reasons that I welcome him being here today. Final couple of points. Well, it is interesting as well, the reaction to the introduction of AS. You know, it's a disaster, AS. And it was, of course, very problematic in 2002. But there were curriculum washback effects from the introduction of modular A-level, which were often brought to the surface by people like geographers. You know, we can't spend the first year in exploration of the subject anymore, because it's just a relentless exam treadmill. Many, many things of this kind are present in the evaluation literature of that time. When we come to withdrawing AS, the very people who said the introduction of AS was a complete disaster, have said the removal of AS is a complete disaster. You know, is that crazy? Well, no, because the system has been reconfigured itself to try and optimise itself around the different arrangements. And the removal of AS, Richard and I discussed, because it has actually prevented a flow of data which had begun to be used in a very systematic way by a whole range of institutions, and did enhance in many ways the admissions process, even if it had undesirable effects in part, by way of washbacking. So I think we need to think about admissions, we need to think about the functions of HE, the number of graduates we have in the system. You at Keith's presentation here 6 months ago, the number of highly qualified people trickling down into jobs for which that level of qualification is not actually needed. What is the deal that they think they're entering into during the admissions process? What do they think they're getting? And does it actually pan out in terms of their later life experience? I've been talking to students around the world and they're quite envious of our admissions process. I've talked to students and they find the admissions processes in other nations are quite a problem. I was with a German student who was thinking that he probably would apply to every university in Germany in order to get a place. You know, it's extraordinary. And I think we're also, we mustn't forget that the admissions processes and the UCAS process have been very carefully constructed. You know, UCAS is a membership organisation which is operating for the collective interest of its members and the nation. And we are looking at a possible extension of the UCAS system to vocational qualifications, so not only to higher education in terms of general education, obviously a lot of HE is vocational engineering and so on, but to apprenticeships and so on. So, interesting. How does it work? Would the same model applied or a variant of it work in other domains? I'll end where I started. It's not stable. There are a lot of pressures in the system. There's a lot going on in curriculum qualifications. And I can't think, because of the extent to which he has done very good work on ensuring that we look at admissions under data forensically, I can't think of somebody better to actually take us through the history, the current situation, and to have a look at some futures. So, Richard.
Well, that was an immensely kind and unwarranted introduction, and I do hope you won't all fall asleep during the next hour. I think the key thing for me in all of this is that this provides us with an opportunity. Lots of people are interested and have potentially great contributions to make. An opportunity for us to discuss in the second half of this evening's session some of the issues that I raised. Some of them I'm sure you will disagree with, some of them you might be interested in. What I want to do is start off with personal perspective, really. I'm going to talk about my own history, actually, in admissions, the adventures of Richard in admissions, and then the further adventures of Richard in admissions, over actually nearly 30 years, extraordinarily. Then look at the wider context against which that occurred. Think about the faults in the system. I think the system has huge strengths, and I think that although there are faults, most of them are no one's fault. This is what I'm a political historian by trade, and everything comes back to structure at some level. Individuals make a huge difference, but they operate within structure. And I think a lot of the time the structure creates a sort of stasis, an unhelpful stability. So I agree with Tim that actually the situation is unstable because everything is pretty much creaking at the seams. But at the core of it, there is a degree of stability that is perhaps surprising across time. I want us to think a little bit about PQA, though I have most of the same reservations about it as Tim, and then think about routes forward, and that will lead into our discussion. So I'm senior tutor of Churchill College at the University of Cambridge. It gives me, I'm enormously lucky to have the insight that provides me with into transition. Students thinking about why they want to go to university. We have to think about this because we have to attract them. I'm ultimately responsible for admissions in my college, as well as having been a university admissions tutor for many, many years. So we bring the students in, we witness them in transition, we look at the ways in which they succeed or struggle during transition, and then as their degree course progresses. And because you're looking at them in the round within an interdisciplinary context, and because you're looking at people from many nations and lots of different backgrounds, you get insight into the way that these things occur. And much of that, I'm sure, has influenced the way that I think about the problems that we're going to be thinking about today. I mentioned that I was a political historian. In fact, I'm on sabbatical at the moment, so right now I'm really just doing political history, and it's great. Having spent most of the last 18 years heavily embedded in university management, having time to write again is wonderful. But it does give me insight into the ways that systems might be functioning and might function differently. You're trained to analyse these things. And the other thing that gives me, I think, an investment in the process is my own background. I'm a first-generation university entrant, as I suspect many people in this room are as well. I was a Cambridge undergraduate in the late 1980s. I went through the process. And because I come from what might now be called a widening participation background, I always felt a commitment to other people in a similar situation, and I was always interested in what was going on. And in lots of ways, that interfaced with my interest as an historian in the interrelationship between people and structures to produce in the mid-late 1990s, so just a really strong feeling on my part that what I wanted to do academically, in addition to the history, was focus more than anything upon education and social mobility and success. And the starting point of that was always going to be the admissions system. So my career has really been significantly about admissions since the year 2000. For 3 years before then, I was involved in admissions interviews for history in the college that I was then a fellow of. And that was a very interesting and salutary introduction into the way admissions processes work. So I have 3 decades, as I said a moment ago, of perspective on this. Some of it insight, certainly perspective, and direct experience in recruitment and selection in the last 20 years. Much has changed. It's through that experience, I think, that I became one of the pioneers of what we often refer to as a data-driven approach in Cambridge to admissions, which emerged in the 2000s. I'm by no means the only one, but I think it probably is fair to say that I was one of the people who was most interested in institutionalising it and in sharing the information with the wider world. And that, I think, is incredibly important. And if there is one take-home message from this evening, it's that we should be looking at all of these things systematically, and we should be telling one another what's going on. There should be a pool of information and expertise that is generously shared across the sector in the interests of students, and in the interests, most of all, of good outcomes for students. And this is something that I think is worth just defining for a moment. A good outcome for a student is not who gets into which university. It's who comes out of which university having had a really good and successful 3 or 4 years with a good degree and good life chances. And the mismatch between what students, their parents, quite often their schools and colleges completely understandably want, which is getting in, and the reality of what they need, which is successfully getting out, I think creates quite a lot of the tensions that we have in the system. We need to think about all of this systematically, systemically. Now, my own experience, I applied to university in 1986 through a UCAS process that is remarkably similar to the process that we have today. In fact, to all intents and purposes, it was identical. What was it like? Well, what on earth were they looking for? You know, this was completely baffling. What was a personal statement supposed to say? Was there any guidance on this? Well, back in the day, not really, there wasn't. Is there guidance now? Well, I'm sure you all know, you've hopped on the relevant websites. There is so much guidance that students are still completely baffled by all of the people telling them to do other choices. same as today. The universities said, these are the grades that we require, and I chose places that were asking for a mix of A's and B's. Cambridge was my mental first choice, and I thought they were likely to ask me for 2 A's and a B, and further down my mental list at all good universities, I was interested in going to them all. I thought I might get an offer of an A and 2 B's or 3 B's. Well, the first offer that came out was 2 E's, and this was when universities, of course, many of you will remember, mass interviewed. So I was then interviewed by a series of universities, and they all asked me which other offers I'd received. And out came the 2 E's offers, again and again and again, so the system totally out the window. When I finally came to my Cambridge interview, which was at the end, the chronological end of the process, and I received an offer of AAB grades 1 and 2 instead, I was outraged. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was a race to the bottom game in which I was going to be the victor. And in a way, I'm sure that actually of course, aspects of that don't occur now. Universities aren't allowed to ask you what else is going on, and nor would they want to. They think it was wrong. But one of the points that I'm going to come back to is the mismatch between what universities say they're going to do and what they actually do, and what that means for students applying. So, at the time, I didn't experience it as traumatic. The system seemed fine. And I guess I was one of the people who, and it remains the case today, there are people in this situation who was effectively happy to game the system. I didn't know how to game the system. The system seemed to allow me to game it whether I knew what I was doing or not. But in the end, that's not very satisfactory. And that's not the way we get students who aren't confident and don't have good advice into the right sorts of institutions for them in the interests of this country as well as the individuals. Now, Cambridge stood out actually in 1986 because it was the one system that was transparent. In fact, if you ask me why I chose Cambridge rather than Oxford, the primary motivation was that Cambridge had moved away from mysterious internal exams and heavy emphasis upon interviews, and had produced a new examination, STEP, which was based on the A-level syllabus and asked more explorative and challenging questions. And in the end, I liked the idea that I would have a higher chance of receiving a conditional offer, and then I would have to prove myself in an exam that, broadly speaking, I could prepare myself reasonably well for, because it was pretty clear what the exam wanted me to do. A very challenging exam, a very interesting exam, but there it was. I now know, having seen the data from the inside, that when I applied, something like 1.8 offers were made for every available place. So it was a system that was very much loaded towards the August end of the process. That was where the action really happened. And in many ways, knowing what I know now about the interrelationship between exam results and outcomes at university, this was a system that was more or less destined to produce good outcomes for students. But it was also a system that deterred applications, and in due course, after a period of years, Cambridge, apart from in mathematics, where it remained, abandoned STEP because it was just deterring too many applicants. Step forward to the mid-1990s, and I became an academic and was involved in admissions for the first time. The absence of STEP, combined with ever-improving A-level results, meant that effectively, there we were, groping in the dark, as we tried to choose the right students for us, place the right people in the right courses. We had application forms identical to those that I had used, pretty much identical to those that we use today, very difficult to judge. The range of backgrounds of students filling them in, lack of experience, huge experience and support, what do you make of it? So nothing much there. You were left resting upon interview. Fortunately, at the time, for 2 or 3 years, we had absolutely no idea that interviews were such a problematic selection tool. And in fact, if you're new to the game and you interview, interviews seem to work incredibly well. You get fantastically positive and strong indications from that individual interaction in the interview with the would-be student. You come out at the end of it absolutely sure that you've identified a group of people who are really outstanding and a much wider group of people who would really struggle. And I remember that so vividly. When I became an admissions tutor in the year 2000, I found myself face to face directly with the consequences of that system. Many mistakes were made. Complaints were legion. So the admissions process would finish essentially in early January, and all of February and March would be taken up with dealing with complaints from candidates, their parents, their teachers. Now, some of those complaints didn't have that much merit, but it was very difficult to explain the decision. In the end, the decision was about interview. You said, well, unfortunately, X didn't do as well at interview as the other people who we made offers to. Well, that's because you conducted the interview incompetently. Okay? Which, indeed, we might have done. I don't think we did most of the time. I think interviews, so far as interviews can be effective, were effective. But how do you argue that? It's very difficult. And at least half of the time, I came away at the end of the conversation with the teacher in the school thinking, yes, we definitely cocked that one up. It wasn't our fault necessarily that we cocked it up, but we've missed one. This is the best person they've had in the school for the last 5 years. We had no way of knowing. What happened is that he was a bit flat at interview. And compared with people who weren't flat, who seemed sparky and interested, they were squeezed out at the margins. Disastrous in so many ways. We also, of course, as teaching academics, experienced the people who we thought were going to be brilliant and turned out not to be. They were almost all clever, but they were lazy. And the data that we had available to us when we selected them didn't really allow us to identify that with reliability. Quite often there would be heavy hints at it in a reference, but even if 10% of your references you feel you can't completely rely on, the whole system starts to be undermined. You feel that you can't place that sort of credence upon the information. So very, very difficult. And of course, the outcomes were poor in terms of widening participation in particular. At this time, in the mid-late 1990s, only around 50% of Cambridge entrants came from state schools. Diversity was extremely low. And remember that back in the 1970s, the state school proportion in Cambridge had been well into the 60s, in fact at one point in the upper 60s. So this was a difficult, difficult time. The conclusion at the time, certainly the conclusion in retrospect, and there was an interesting time between the two when, if you like, you were starting to realise quite how problematic the system was. You didn't quite know where you were going to go, but you had a sense of where it might go. And I looked yesterday actually at some of the documentation that we produced in the early 2000s as we were trying to explore these issues more systematically. It was striking, rereading the minutes of meetings again, seeing the conversations that were happening. We were starting to find our way out of the darkness. A remarkable time in lots of ways. But it seems so clear now that what we had was no hard information, apart from GCSE results, which, as many of you know, are not very easy to use because they're so dependent upon school and personal background. And there was far too much social and cultural judgment in the process. And there are risks in much that is being said at the moment, actually, about the need to build up confidence and character in young people, that we will drift back into those bad old days of cultural and social judgment. People didn't mean it. You know, they didn't say, we don't want somebody like him at this university or that university. But they did say, I don't think he'll fit in here. And it's not really in his interest to come. He'll do much better elsewhere. Well, there is a one-word answer to that, which I won't be using today. The cavalry were unexpected when they came. They were disguised as a set of examinations that we all looked at and thought, this is terrible. AS level. I remember seeing the syllabuses for the first time, seeing the first papers, seeing the first essays that students had written in preparation for exams at the end of year 12, and thinking how reductionist, how directive, how dirigiste, how narrow, teaching to the test gone mad. This is crazy, crazy stuff. Crazy, crazy stuff. And in many ways, I think, academics have continued, in many institutions at least, to think that way. This is not what we think education should be like. It's not what university education is like. It doesn't work, it can't work. Except we found that it did. We didn't expect it to, but it did. How did we find out? We found out by accident. We found out because although we were ignoring the marks, the the unit scores, the UMS that students were receiving under the new system, teachers were writing them in references. And we started to notice that there seemed to be a correlation between people who had achieved very high marks, very high UMS in their AS levels, and very good outcomes in Cambridge. So we started to gather the data through our admissions process, initially via paper questionnaires, and then later through a much more highly systemised electronic process. And we began to analyse. It was about 2003 when we first started to notice in a number of colleges that there were these really surprising correlations between this exam that we didn't like and outcomes in Cambridge, which we were after. About 2005, we established the first committee in the university to look at this, and I set that committee up because although conversations were going on among individual academics about these patterns, there was no forum actually for spreading this information systematically across the whole university. And I've always been a believer in, as I say, sharing information for the good of the students. The creation of that committee then led to the opportunity for us to employ research staff, and that's been the case now for the best part of a decade. And steered by this committee of admissions tutors and admissions officers, the dedicated research staff started to produce systematic examinations of the interrelationship between what we looked at when we selected and outcomes for students. And no one had ever done this before. And they'd certainly never done it on the scale that we were now doing it. And in a way, it produced a new dimension, a new perspective on Cambridge admissions that the admissions tutors of the university and in time the academic community more widely became really committed to, which is this, that we should not do anything in selection unless we can show that it works. And showing it works is not about saying, I've been here for 20 years and I know it works. Showing it works is about completing the research, publishing it on your website or elsewhere, making it available to other people so that you can say, we've made this decision about you, about your child, about your student. You might find the decision difficult to understand, but this is why we made it. Here is the information. And what we found is that actually almost everybody in the process, students, teachers, parents, started to buy into this in really helpful ways. By 2007, UMS AS level was acting as a safety net, stopping us from rejecting people on the basis of bad interviews alone. And again, this is an innovation that I introduced because it struck me that there were these people who just had a bad day, who the system was losing, who we somehow needed to give a second chance to. By 2011, it was very clear. We had the first longitudinal studies, multiple regression studies that were showing that UMS was far and away the best indicator we had of future potential at university. Much better than anything else. By 2012, partly in a response to the £9,000 tuition fee and offer, we had a fully systemised process by which UMS were embedded in a selection procedure across the whole intercollegiate university, in which we had the same information set about every student. For the first time in your college, you didn't just see the information in relation to the students who'd applied to you. You saw the information for the students who'd applied to the whole university. So you might have a field of, I don't know, in my college in Churchill, 20 historians. You would know what their rank order was in terms of grade profile, but you would also know where they sat in the entire field of applicants to the university. This additional perspective, enormously helpful. And as this process built, we saw improving outcomes, really significantly improving outcomes. More state sector students. Now, 62% is not as high as many people think it should be. That's where we are today. It is in line with the pattern of A-level and other examination performance post-16 in the UK. So if we were admitting on the basis of track record, this is where we should be. It's an enormous advance. I mean, those of us who are in university admissions, as most of us are, or many of us in this room are, certainly all interested in it. It's an enormous advance on the position that we were in 15, 20 years ago, where only 50% of our students were coming from the state sector. To achieve a 10, 11, 12% increase and sustain it across time is not an easy thing to do, particularly if you're not doing it by cooking the books in any way. You're simply doing your best to take best people. We've seen greater diversity. Now, some of that is about a changing Britain and a changing world, but some of it is about selection and improvements in education, secondary education, and to a degree, advice, despite the limits in resource for advice that we've seen for most of the last decade and a half. We've also seen better degree outcomes in Cambridge. Now, any examination system will tend to see grade inflation over time, unless it's actively guarded against. If you look at patterns of grade inflation in Cambridge, the interesting thing is that there was a period in the early 2000s when there was no grade inflation at all. There was a flat line for quite a long time, the best part of a decade. And it was really only when these changes in the admissions process fully kicked in that we started to see results building again. As a university teacher, I simply teach far fewer students who aren't up to it than I did in the old days. There's almost no one I come across now who isn't really interested and really hardworking and able. So outcomes have been really good. And in dealing with complaints, well now, it's not a 5-minute job. There are still people who, well, there are people who can have an argument in an empty room. And no matter what you say, there will be people who are dissatisfied with the explanation as to why their application was not successful. But the numbers are tiny. And there are effectively no cases where you think, well, actually, we completely missed this one. It's a remarkable, remarkable change. So what this all amounted to was this accidental thing that happened to us that we didn't expect. UMS turned into highly informative, perhaps a uniquely informative, and a highly granular number. Tim and I, when we've talked about these things so many times, have said, what we need when we select is a number that tells you where this person sits by comparison with all of the other students who are applying, or the vast bulk of the other students who are applying. And for us, UMS achieved this. There it was at the heart of the system, we cracked it. Of course, it's now going to disappear. It's going to disappear, I think, because although UMS, as you know, is disappearing because there is no need to have UMS in a non-modular system. AS levels, I think, will disappear because schools won't have the resource to continue with them after the next year. I fully expect that although there will be some AS levels sitting this year, from next year, it will disappear away. So in a way, we're back to square one. But while all this was going on, what was the wider context? Let's have a think about that. It seems to me that the critical thing here is something that we don't talk about very often, which is that if you go back to 1970, only 1 in 20 people in the UK went to university. By 1990, it was 10%. By the year 2000, 1 in 5. And now it's 40%, a little bit above 40% in fact. You look at those figures, it's an incredible rise. Steady, of course, between 1970 and 1990, but really taking off, and particularly taking off in the last 15 years. A big, big difference. What was happening in university in the meantime was that, certainly for all of that initial period, incomes were squeezed. Universities found that they couldn't really afford to continue to run admissions processes in the way that they'd done before. So many more applicants, you can't carry on interviewing them all. You simply don't have the resource. And also, university funding had shifted. Now, the research excellence framework and its predecessors, the research assessment exercise in particular, meant that academics couldn't afford to spend vast time on things outside their research and their teaching. Certainly not outside universities like this that are intrinsically rich in resource, essentially because of their private income, their private situation. So the system had to become more basic in a way. Now, basic is not necessarily worse. If a complex system allows you to exercise lots of social judgments, it's not necessarily in anyone's interests. In fact, it probably isn't in very many people's interests at all. Nonetheless, the system shifted. A big change that we saw was the emergence of admissions testing. Mass admissions testing, particularly in law and in medicine, across many universities. Big differences. During the same time, A-level was reformed, obviously significantly in the year 2000, with the introduction of curriculum 2000 and AS level, and now the clock is being turned back to where we were previously. An interesting time, I think. Like lots of people, I mean that category of people that Tim talked about earlier who initially were horrified by S level, and then in time began to see it as an enormous positive. Didn't want it to go. In the big consultations on this, 83% of teachers, universities, employers said, no, the system is fine. Let's keep it as it is. But it is going, and I think we need to recognise that the boat has sailed and it's not coming back anytime soon. At the same time these changes were occurring, concerns were really starting to coalesce around social mobility, around access, under the Blair government, and taken up actually with a vengeance in a way by the coalition, and continue to be very, very much alive today, right at the top of government. A very interesting shift in the Conservative Party from the Thatcher Major years to now. Of course, Mr Major himself was interested in social mobility, but there wasn't the investment in it, there wasn't the personal investment in it. I'm not really talking about physical investment. The personal investment in it that I believe exists today. Not all of that investment, I think, is the right sort of investment, but it is there. In the face of all of this, big shift, big change, rising concerns, it seems to me really striking that the UK-wide HE application system, UCAS, essentially remained the same. That's the bit in the process that has been fundamentally stable. So let's think about its core elements. And I should stress, this is not to criticise UCAS. It's simply to reflect on what I have seen for many years, first as an applicant and of course latterly as a university selector. The key elements, the core elements, the track record, GCSE profile essentially, and actually that's the only hard data element that a university sees. So if it wants numbers to try and make its decisions, that's the only hard number it's got. There may be other numbers that it can access through UCAS, particularly in relation to social data, but those numbers aren't hard numbers either. There are huge problems with them. What statisticians will often refer to as ecological fallacy, the gap between when the census was completed and the assembling of the data, the gap between a six-figure postcode and the reality of an individual living within that postcode. So the hard data is the GCSE results. A-level predictions, famously, I think we should celebrate it actually, 50% wrong. You know, what a brilliant figure. That's what I think you'll get. Depends which way the wind is blowing. And of course, are my predictions as a university tutor correct about my students' results? Well, they're broadly correct, but definitely the opposite, at the optimistic end of the spectrum. I mean, that's inevitable. You teach somebody, you like them, they work really hard, they deserve to do well. How do you think they're going to do? They hack you off, they don't turn up for supervisions, they hand in work late, they're totally self-absorbed. How do you want them to do? You know, most students are nice, so most of them, you know, you're on their side. It's not school's fault that predictions are wrong 50% of the time, it's natural, but they are wrong. A personal statement. I remember writing mine as I say, what on earth am I supposed to do with this? Still, it's free form after all of these years. It's opaque to applicants. A huge range of advice about what to do. It's inevitably socially and culturally biased. It's got to be. You sit with your mum and dad around a dining table every night and chat about stuff. You watch the news, you talk about politics, you talk about what your dad is doing in the high-tech firm in which he works. You've got stuff you can say. If none of those things ever happens, where do you start? Really difficult, I think. So when I say they're susceptible to too much help and preparation, I'm not, you know, nobody is you know, doing bad things. It's inevitable that this will happen. Reference, not quite as bad with the reference, but it's also free form. Varies very significantly in usefulness according to the experience of the school. There are school references where the school knows exactly what university admissions tutors are looking for, and they are almost consciously pressing all of the buttons that they know need to be pressed. It's a minority of references, but you see it. And there are other references where the reference is, and we know this because we see many candidates coming from the same school, the reference is, apart from the name of the student, identical for all of the candidates from a particular school. And completely generic. And then, of course, the spectrum in between, with a big range of utility in it. So very hard to use references, even though we trust schools, we believe, broadly speaking, of course we believe what they say, but the range of experience is so wide. We still have, to my mind, surprisingly restricted choices for students. Now maybe that's change, I hope it will. But it seems to me that choosing 5 universities out of all of the universities in the UK, when so many of them are so difficult to get into, they're so competitively applied for, and writing a free-form personal statement on a side of A4 or receiving a free-form reference on a side of A4, this is about the days of 10% of the population going to university and everything being on paper. It's an historical artifact, it's a relic of the past. Now that's not to say that the system is not working, but surely we can think about some of this again. It's got to be possible to do things in a different way. I said earlier it's not UCAS's fault. I don't think anybody is to blame for this. I think it's systemic. And the complicity of individual universities is not a matter of moral guilt. It's just sort of happened. Why? Well, in a way, the final point on this slide is perhaps the starting point for this. A kind of well-meaning complacency, other pressures, research, teaching, no need to change the system. Nobody's saying, hang on a minute, are you sure these interviews work? Are you sure using a panel of current undergraduates to select medical students is the right way of doing things? Oh, well, we seem to get very good outcomes that way. Which test should we use? Should we use the UCAT, or should we use BMET? We're going to use UCAT because that's the one that will work best for our students. How do we know? We think it will. That's the sum total of analysis being applied in many places much of the time. And a lack of external scrutiny. Now, if you're from Cambridge or from Oxford, you live in this really weird world in which everyone is interested in you, and they jolly well shouldn't be. Not because there is nothing to be interested in, of course there are interesting things to consider here, but lots of other places matter just as much. But they don't get anything like the level of external scrutiny that we get. So in a way, I think perhaps we've been helped by the fact that we've had to answer for what we do in a way that many other universities haven't. And this is not to say that we here at Oxford, we're running better systems than other people. I don't think we necessarily are. But I think there is that sense of public accountability which doesn't exist elsewhere to the same degree. It exists a little bit, but not to the same degree. And against this background, big pressures, in a way no pressure, over admissions. Universities have tended to focus upon maintaining competitive advantage in a competitive system. They need the students, they need people to occupy their places so that they can mend the roof. And it's as simple as that. That's the way the economics of it work in most universities. It doesn't work that way here, but in most universities, that's what it's all about. We need to get students in. And the key thing, therefore, is that University X is more attractive to the student than University Y. And there are various ways in which we can do that. We can say, well, you have to make us your firm offer, not your firm offer, not your insurance offer, in order for us to give you accommodation in the best halls in your first year. If you do that, we'll give you a £1,500 bursary, but if we're your insurance offer, you won't get the bursary. So there are various ways in which the system is being gamed by universities in their own completely understandable financial interest. But also the system is gamed around the admissions process, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But all of this has been contrary, in my view, to what's in the interest of students. What we really need universities to be doing is, rather than focusing upon simply cutting their own swathe through a rather creaky and opaque and unacceptable system, we need them to be saying, how can we make this system better for students? And we're all guilty of not doing this. So I remember very vividly discussions within Cambridge when we discovered something that looked a bit like a holy grail in UMS. And at committee level, we said, well, actually, we've got a system now that we could simply make available freely to all other universities. We could say, here are the spreadsheets, here is the correlation data, it will give you a starting point, this is how you go about creating your own correlation data, here you can make your process much more robust. And we decided not to do it because we didn't want to lose competitive advantage. We don't want to give this to Oxford. We want Oxford to take a load of duffers who they're not spotting, we arrogantly think. So we don't need to take that was what was going on. And so we're guilty, like many other people are guilty. But the gaming of the system for institutional purposes is absolutely clear. I've talked a little bit already about what goes on around accommodation, but look at offer levels. And I did this yesterday. Of course, I knew about it anecdotally from talking to teachers and parents and to students. But I went on to Unistats and Which University and UCAS, all in their ways actually quite difficult to navigate, whether it's a Mac or a PC, all in a way overloading a potentially baffled 16-and-a-half-year-old with information that they can't possibly understand. Unistats, you look at Cambridge University, the first thing you're directed to is the QAA report on education in Cambridge. You click the link and open up the report, and it says that Cambridge has met the necessary levels in the key areas. And it particularly commends the university's General Board Education Committee and the subsection on education for their work in maintaining high standards in Cambridge. Now those bodies are excellent, but if your average 16-and-a-half-year-old, their eyes glazed over 2.5 minutes ago, now what on earth does this stuff mean? And this government is directing 16-year-olds to this as the first point of call. Now, people are completely baffled by the process, understandably baffled. Nonetheless, if you know how to steer your way through it, you can look at offer levels, and you can see so many universities where the offer level is X, and you look at the grade profile of the people getting in, which is quite hard to get at because it's expressed in both UCAS points, which are very difficult to fathom if you don't understand the system. Even if you do understand the system, quite hard to fathom. And then individual grades in individual subjects, but the overall picture is clear. There are universities where the standard offer is way lower than the actual standard of entry, and there are universities where the standard offer is significantly higher than the actual standard of entry. And of course, if we're talking about the Russell Group, by and large, you're talking about the same sort of formal offer level. 2 A's and B's, sometimes 3 A's, maybe an A star and 2 A's, that sort of level. But what's actually going on around, this is the offer that, this is our standard offer, is just all over the place. So how on earth are you supposed to navigate that? And some universities actually are a little bit clearer about the fact that things are open. They will say our standard offer in this subject is AAA to ABB. Again, if you're a 16-and-a-half-year-old, how do you know which offer applies to you? Now, where do you begin with that? You might ring them up and ask if you're really confident and you can find a phone number. I don't know what answer you'll get. I suppose you'll get it will depend upon the circumstances, which would be a perfectly fair and honest answer. But it doesn't leave the 16-and-a-half-year-old any further forward. And then there are the other things that universities say they look for. The number of times I've heard in presentations to students that universities are interested in wider contribution. Well, what is wider contribution? Is it being from a different sort of background? Is it doing stuff? Is it being good at rugby? If it's the latter, or analogous things, is it actually a proxy for being middle class and probably white? I mean, these are really, I think, potentially dangerous things. What does the student make of it? And then we get to universities' use of still invalid or poorly evidenced selection methods. Now, I don't think they're doing this for the wrong reasons. I think universities are all trying to do their best, often under quite difficult resource circumstances. But if you look at admissions testing in particular, interviews are a much less used business, it seems to me now, than admissions testing. But the information on some of the really big admissions tests that's out there is incredibly thin. There is no information to take the national law test on the website about the interrelationship between what happens in the test and outcomes at university. There is simply nothing there. The website says, well, this assesses ability that is not expressed in exams. It's looking for aptitude, it's looking for some sort of, natural talent. But it doesn't tell you why, and it doesn't tell you whether this does work. And we know from our own experience in using the national law test at Cambridge that actually the correlations were extremely weak. It's why we stopped using it. Now, that's not to say that the LMAT doesn't work at other universities. It might work very well. But there is no evidence to that effect anywhere there. And given that that and other big tests cost students money to sit, is that acceptable? Is it acceptable to charge somebody £50 to sit a test on which there is no evidence of validity? I mean, that cannot be acceptable, surely. So we've ended up with a system which is fundamentally heterogeneous. Everywhere you look, the university is doing something slightly different. The only bit actually that is constant is, thank goodness, a UCAS process at the middle of it. But if we really want people from widening participation backgrounds to participate, to progress, surely we have to make it clear. We cannot have this confusion, this over-complexity, and this lack of transparency. Are people satisfied? Well, we hear again and again and again in schools concerns about outcomes. I think it's got easier in the last 2-3 years, and that's because within the context of the £9,000 tuition fee, universities operating at the most competitive level, that AAB, ABB, 3A's level, were most, actually the biggest single group of applicants are applying. Those universities have been able to ease their numbers. And that's meant, I think, actually, that there have been fewer problematic outcomes for individuals in the last 2 years than there were hitherto. But that's the bottleneck being eased for the wrong reasons, not for the right reasons. We've seen with KIS, with Unistats, with Which University and other independent providers, a widely supported move to provide students with better information. And of course, that's probably the right thing to do. But what information, how much of it, how accessible, how understandable? Nonetheless, it's an indication that people know things could be better. But the key indicator to me that people remain dissatisfied with the system is the fact that PQA keeps coming back on the agenda. I mean, in a way, it's what Tim said. It's the ultimate logical solution. You actually apply when you've got results. You know exactly where you're working. Universities know where they're working too. So in a way, you can see why it keeps coming back. But it's coming back also because the existing system is creaking. However, it's a false prospectus, and it's a false prospectus for a number of reasons, which seem to me inevitable to defeat its implementation. The first to mention that we have a relatively short period in which to get students up to a high academic standard. Year 12, year 13, compressing A-level would have, I think, inappropriate and unacceptable educational consequences, and trying to compress the marking, where there are already great concerns about marking, would be similarly problematic. So we can't really shorten it by, I mean, the most you might manage would be a week, I would say, possibly a fortnight. Anything more than that, completely impossible. You've also got the problem of the increasing internationalism of undergraduate admissions in the UK. If you want to recruit the best international students, you can't keep them hanging on to August for a decision. You've got to make a decision much earlier than that. And if you want to run a gathered field process, which is in the interests of fairness and all students, then everybody's got to wait until the whole field has assembled. So for many universities for whom foreign students are critical to their economic survival, delaying the process is really, really dangerous. The rhythm of the international academic research year also militates against a shift. It's not easy for universities simply to say we're going to start later or earlier, or we're going to lose a large part of the research period in the summer to making decisions. It's not obvious that this is a sustainable way to go. We can't change the way the whole academic cycle works internationally. And it seemed to me that the last proposals on PQA that came from UCAS a handful of years ago really expressed the biggest danger herein, which is that you have to restrict student choice further in order to get it to work. And in a system in which it's very, very difficult to get into, maybe a dozen or 20 very good universities, saying to students you're only allowed to choose one or two of these surely can't be sustainable. So I think PQA is a false horizon. There's an alternative way forward, though, and I don't think it's that radical. It requires the system to be tweaked in certain ways. One of the tweaks Tim is not going to like, on the basis of what he said at the start, but I think it's probably necessary. And we've seen an indication of how this might go by looking at our own experience in Cambridge with UMS. As I say, results at the end of year 12, I think, will go. But research on A-level has repeatedly shown that A-level is a strong and reliable predictor of future university performance. It identifies potential consistently and well. Again, like Tim, I don't understand where the view comes from that A-level doesn't predict. Every study that's ever been done on A-level shows that it predicts. It emphatically predicts. So what we need to do, I think, is consider a formal system in which A-level is at its heart as a valid and granular basis for entry. The number that I talked about earlier in relation to UMS that would minimise complexity and potentially maximise transparency. And this is what A-level is all about. It was created in 1951 as a university entrance exam. It's always been a university entrance exam. There are some teachers, educationists, who talk about the need to return A-level to being a pure educational experience in the sixth form. The pure educational experience is a very happy side effect of a university entrance exam. We need to recognise that's its job. In a sense, we should focus on the thing that does this best, and we know A-level does. But we can only do this if we think about the system as a whole, and changing A-level is not the only change that we need to make. So just to focus on A-level for a few more moments. The two major studies that I commend to you, Hefty 2003 and Hefty 2014, the latter essentially an update of the former, both evidenced A-level's utility as an indicator of potential. There is no arguing with them, and it seems to me that they are really, really solid pieces of work that prove the case. And we've got some new work by Peter Chetwynd, formerly of this university, and now by colleagues from Cambridge Assessment, Carmen and Nadir, both here this evening. I'm delighted to see them. New work this year looking at the interrelationship between the A-star grade, which as you know is relatively new, and outcomes at university, showing the same thing. Again, strong correlations with outcomes at university. Within Cambridge, we've completed further research looking at the interrelationship between number of A-stars and outcomes. We've looked now at all year groups, we've looked at all subjects, and we found essentially that with a tiny number of exceptions, number of A-stars at A-level correlates well with outcomes in every subject and in every year. Indeed, in our biggest subject, natural sciences, the correlations get stronger over time. You don't get regression to the mean. It's extraordinary. This shouldn't happen. So this is not just something that is working at point of entry, it's working even better in some subjects as students progress through their course. So, powerful, powerful tool. And it makes sense because A-level provides the key things that you need for success at university. It measures them. It provides you with core knowledge and it measures that core knowledge. It provides you with key technical skills and it measures those technical skills. And beyond those, it measures other things that contribute to potential very actively as well. Stickability, focus, calmness, the ability to prioritise, and of course intelligence, imagination, creativity, logic. It's not a perfect exam, there is no perfect exam, but there seems to me to be no doubt that for its limitations, it is doing these things very well. And the great thing about using A-level rather than using additional tests or additional exams is it erects no further barriers to entry. Students are going to do A-levels anyway because that's the core curriculum for most people in the UK schools. You place that at the heart of university admissions, you're making it as easy as you can in terms of additional barriers to entry. But I think we do need some change to A-level to maximise its utility. Firstly, we need to restore faith in marking. Now, my own view is that quite a lot of the talk about the unreliability of A-level marking in recent years has been verging on the hysterical. I won't go into detail at this stage about that, but it is undoubtedly the case that A-level marking remains very reliable in most subjects almost all of the time. We also need to be realistic about how reliable any marking system can be. If you want a marking system that produces 100% correct outcomes every time, then you need to have everything done in multiple choice and marked by a computer. If you want a system that can assess creativity and imagination, people going beyond the syllabus, you need a system which is assessed by people who are allowed to make judgments. And it is inevitable in any system, no matter how good those people are, sometimes those judgments might be wrong. And there's another reality here as well, which again as a university teacher, I experience with my own students sitting exams all too regularly, which is that students who you really rate highly sometimes don't perform as well as you thought they were going to. You know, that is the nature of it. And that's not necessarily because anything has gone wrong with the exam. Maybe actually they're not as good as you thought they were. Or maybe they're just not that good at this particular form of assessment. So we have to be realistic about the system. It does seem to me that we can have a system that gets the right results 99% of the time. And we're not quite there yet. So improvement is needed, particularly in some subjects. But the problem at the heart of this is all about recruiting and retaining good examiners. The difficulty there is that the major exam boards are all absolutely up against it financially. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that at the present time, it's not obvious to me that any of the major exam boards is, in the long term, financially viable without significant changes. So where the money to recruit these better examiners is going to come from, I don't know. People say it's not about money, it's about other things. What we need to do is embed examining as part of progression in school teachers' careers. Great idea, but that of course is resource intensive as well. And when so many schools are being squeezed financially, where is the money going to come from? Where is the time off lessons going to come to enable people to do this properly? Where is the money going to come for seniority points within the pay scale that accords with being, for example, a senior examiner? So in the end, the system needs more investment, and at the moment, neither the exam boards nor schools and colleges are in a situation to provide it. So that's something that we all need to think about very hard. You get what you pay for. We want a better examination system, it's going to cost more money. The second thing I think we need to change, patch 18, is grading. There's nothing wrong with A-star. This is not another person saying we need higher standards. If you look at students attaining 3 A-stars, new research actually from within Cambridge Assessment by Tim Gill, which I was very grateful to see, shows that in 2014, people achieving 3 A-stars constituted 3% of the cohort, the top 3% of people sitting 3 A-levels and excluding results in general studies and critical thinking. Now, I don't know any university that needs to identify more than the top 3% by ability range. That surely is rarefied enough. But given the current grade structure, the next percentile that you can identify at 2 A-stars and an A is the top 7%. And after that, 1 A-star and 2 A's gives you the top 12%. Well, what if you're looking for the top 5% of the ability range? Or the top 10%? You can't get them, not using this system. So we do need something that gives us a little bit more traction, more granularity as part of selection. We need this also because if you look at those key grades, A-star and particularly A and B, which are absolutely where it's at, that's where the action is in terms of getting into the most competitive differential universities, 54% of the grades being awarded are at that level. So it's clear that there needs to be something more finely grained. And maybe the lack of fine grain around A and B in particular is one of the reasons why university entry levels seem to be so opaque and unrelated to, at least in some cases, what actually happens. We need more grades to play with. If we had more grades to play with, we could use the system to sort more finely among applicants. We could make more conditional offers, so you have a higher chance of receiving an offer when you apply, and the offer then does the work for the system at the end. Now that would inevitably mean that there would be more people perhaps not getting into their first choice. But as Tim said earlier, the key thing is not necessarily about an individual getting into the place that they've placed number 1, but that they get into the right sort of university, the right level of university for them. And we all know that in most cases there are a whole handful of universities that would do very well for any given student. You might also say, well, if you up the offer levels, you'll put people off and there will be a widening participation penalty. But the evidence in Cambridge of our early use of A-star was exactly the opposite. It was the early use of A-star and use of UMS. It was making the exam more important in the process and using its teeth that enabled us to widen participation better than we'd widened participation since the 1970s. It's counterintuitive, but to my mind, it's unarguable. Because what you do is you take the social capital out of the process and you place more emphasis on the individual and their ability in exams, which is the thing that is likeliest to tell you whether they will do well and therefore likeliest to produce good outcomes from them in terms of leaving university with a good degree. So this is a really positive outcome for the individual in the long term. I think we also need to think about UCAS. I think we need more scaffolding around the free-form personal statement and the free-form reference. There's always a balance that needs to be struck between allowing people creativity and the possibility of saying something different and leaving people baffled as to what they're supposed to say. And I think we could move further towards saying, actually, we want in this section for you to tell us about how you've explored your proposed subject at university. Now we want you to tell us about your experience of learning in school or college, in the examinations that you've been studying for in the last 18 months. Now maybe you tell us about wider experiences or extracurriculars. Let's give people some structure. Let's make it a little bit easier for them. For references, let's ask for quantification. Now, as university tutors, you write references for graduate school, for your undergraduates. You're almost always asked to do very similar things, which is that you're asked to describe how many students you've taught in the last X years, whether they've been master's students or PhD students, and then you're asked to rank the student you're writing the reference for within the context of those people you've taught. Are they in the top 5%, the top 10%? Are they in the top 20%? Are they in the top 50%? Now, there is no reason why, in an electronic age, you couldn't have a system in which references submitted by teachers with an individual identifier are sucked into a system that then produces a histogram telling you about all of that teacher's references during their career and places the student in the histogram. So you could get around the problem of, I'm sure no one would do this, saying that every student they've taught is in the top 5% of the people they've come across. And these things are not difficult to solve if we're interested in solving them and we invest. I also think that we should reconsider the limit on the number of places and the standard format of one firm and one insurance place that students can apply for and accept. It's not obvious to me what the right number is. I don't think you would want a completely liberal system in which students could simply apply to every university in the land. Clearly everybody would be overwhelmed. But 5 does seem to me to be quite low when so many of the very desirable universities are so difficult to get into. You could easily apply to, I don't know, think about very popular universities, Cambridge, Durham, UCL, Nottingham, UEA, get into none of them for no very good reason. Not because those universities have erred or because anything has gone desperately wrong, just because you've been a bit unlucky. You're good, but maybe not completely outstanding. Maybe if there were another 5 universities on the list, actually there wouldn't be that failure. And maybe it would encourage people to think a bit harder about the universities that they're choosing, perhaps in slightly more interrogative and considered ways. I also think we need to enforce transparency. We should require universities to explain properly on their websites why they select in the way they select, what the elements in the process are intended to do, whether they value personal statement more highly than reference and why, if they use a test, what that test is doing within holistic assessment, and where the interrelationship between decision and outcome can be quantified, it should be. So it shouldn't be possible for a university to say, we'd like 60 quid please, or 50 quid for you to sit this test. And we're not really going to tell you exactly how we use it, and nor are we going to show you that it works. And it just seems to me that that should not be an acceptable situation. So far as admissions testing is concerned, I think that if A-level were at the heart of the system again, which it could be, and if proper multiple regression studies were completed to consider the interrelationship between testing and conditional offers and outcomes, in most cases, a good case would need to be made for using testing. And so this might lead to a natural simplification of the system. Now, actually, good cases for testing can be made a lot of the time, but you need to be very clear why you're using the test and how you're using the test. I also think that universities should be persuaded or compelled to pin entry standards to actual entry standards. In other words, rather than using conditional offers as a marketing tool, we're an AAB university and therefore we must be good. You should apply to us and accept our offer. That universities are required actually to have a standard offer that reflects the standard of the student who gets in. on an ongoing basis. That would give a bigger range. It would enable students to gauge where to pitch their application more effectively. And finally, I think we need to review the data that's provided. There is a lot of it. Some of it I think is potentially very useful, but it's not very accessible. It's not easy to use. We need young people looking at this data and writing a website. I mean, that seems to me absolutely obvious. So to conclude, this has got to be, in the interests of fair admissions, widening participation, and good outcomes at university, the most important thing for individuals. This has got to be a system that bases its decisions upon validity, upon the things that actually will best guarantee good outcomes for students in the future. And at the present time, the best thing that's out there is A-level. So we have to place A-level back at the centre of the process, or more centrally in the process that it currently sits. Since PQA will, I believe, remain impracticable, we will need A-level to help us replicate some of the things that we would like. Transparency, simplicity, the capacity for an individual a little bit lost in the system to understand what's going on. But to do that, we'll need A-levels that have a little bit more traction in them, a bit more granular. We'll need universities to be willing to make conditional offers and in larger numbers. And we need transparency. We can't have smoke and mirrors around everything in the process. All of this, I think, needs to be underpinned by some revisions to the UCAS system. UCAS may have much more extensive and exciting revisions already in mind. I don't know. But that combined with the pressure on universities actually to be publicly scrutinised, to stand by their decisions on the basis of valid reasoning for them, has to be at the heart of the system. I'd be very, very interested to hear your comments and criticisms and perspectives, and thank you for being a patient and kind audience.